Deputy United States Marshal Landon Len Kelly dropped his back to the floor and turned on the lights in the hallway of the Silver Springs, Maryland apartment he shared with his wife. Len was surprised to see his wife sitting on the couch in pitch darkness, waiting for him. There's a glass of wine on the coffee table in front of her, and her red, puffy eyes and the napkin clutched in her hands suggest that something bad has happened. Finding his wife at home, Landon was somewhat surprised. Congresswoman Juliana Diaz Rojas, popularly known as GDR, was rarely home these days after winning election to a second term a few months ago. The junior congresswoman from Chicago had become an increasingly sought-after speaker as the de facto leader of the blue team of young progressive members of the House of Representatives. Julia was a welcome guest on the various 24-hour talk shows that filled the television universe. Her youth, beauty, passion, and eloquence made her a natural fit for television. Wearing glasses, she had the sexy image of a librarian and turned the heads of viewers and interviewers alike. "Hey babe, I'm surprised to see you home. What's up?" Landon said, looking at her. "Looks like you are having a rough day," Landon said, settling into the brown leather chair that had become his since they would been married 9 months ago. "There's an article coming out tomorrow morning in the VP, Washington Post, that implies I'm having an affair," Julia said. "And who does the Post institute you are having an affair with?" Landon asked, not the least bit impressed. "House Speaker Dennis Kilgallon," Julia replied. "What? You've gotta be kidding me. What makes them think you are having an affair with him?" Landon asked. "He is old enough to be your father, in fact even older. Plus, he is one of the most right-wing reactionary in the whole party of right-wing reactionaries. What makes the Post think you are having an affair with him specifically?" Julia clutched the napkin in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Her anguished expression almost made Landon vomit. "You've gotta be kidding me. Are you really sleeping with that? With all the opportunities to be a cheating girlfriend, you choose a bastard who's about to blow up your career? What the hell is this, Julia? How long have you been having sex with him? And who else are you sleeping with behind my back?" Landon was as angry as Julia had ever seen him. She knew he had every right to be upset, but he had no right to lash out at her or call her names. Landon stood up and walked across the living room to the restroom. Julia watched as he washed his face and then placed his hands on either side of the basin, lowered his head, and inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself down. She was actually hurting for her husband, even though she realized she was the source of his pain herself. "I know we have a lot to talk about, but I haven't eaten anything since breakfast. I could use a burger from Visition. We can park at Legacy Oaks and finish this conversation without too much emotion," Landon suggested. After walking through the drive-thru at Whataburgers in McLean, Landon parked his Bronco in a deserted parking lot near George Washington Memorial Park. They took a table with an open view of the Potomac, with no one nearby to disturb them. To their left and behind them was the George W. Bush Intelligence Center. Under other circumstances, it would have been a romantic place to sit and look out over the river. After finishing their meal, Landon started the conversation again. "I was in shock when you told me about it back home, and I am not sure I remembered everything. And here we are in Virginia with a view of Potomac in front of us and no one bothering us. Tell me all about it." Julia began. She and the rest of the blue team were pushing forwards with their signature bill, one that would completely overhaul the healthcare system in the United States. With the Senate led by Democrats and the House of Representatives led by Republicans, it was nearly impossible to get any meaningful legislation passed, and this bill was going to be the most important bill passed in the last 50 years. "You know, we in the United States have the best doctors but the worst healthcare system in the world," We are the most developed country the world has ever known, but we have the 56th highest mortality rates. 55 countries with better mortality rates than us have some form of universal healthcare. Somewhere, someone decided that access to healthcare should be work-related. That doesn't exist in any other country. We have an amazing bill that would completely change the healthcare system in this country, and the right-wingers want to block it, Julia explains. Landon had heard Julia's spunky speech so many times that he no longer considered it touching, but rather an annoying rant. He agreed with her, but privately felt that she and the blue team were trying to attack windmills. If there was money to be made on maintaining the status quo, then the status quo would be maintained. He let Julia rant and blow off the steam for a bit, then gently brought her back to the topic. So, how does working to pass this bill lead to you and the douchebag speaker having to fortunate? Landon asked. The question made Julia blush. It moved gradually, then suddenly came on. We would been meeting for weeks to discuss the bill in private. He acknowledged that the bill was good, but that he couldn't support it publicly. We've had half a dozen meetings over the last 3 months to try to come to an understanding. And have you succeeded? Landon asked. You came to an understanding? Landon's sarcasm didn't escape Julia. The last time we met was 2 days ago. He invited me to his townhouse to finalize an informal agreement. He can't support the bill publicly, but he has agreed that his party in the House of Representatives will not actively fight it. They will be soft-spoken about the high cost and the lack of choice, but they won't fight us. To celebrate, we opened a bottle of wine. When we finished it, he opened another, Julia explains. Julia looked down at her hands, which continued to clutch the napkin she had grabbed from home. We must have had too much to drink, because the next thing I knew, I woke up in bed with him, naked. I can tell we had sex. Julia sobbed quietly as she told Landon about it. So, not just sex, but unprotected sex. Yes, she said quietly. No condoms were used. I have Nexplanon, a hormonal contraceptive implant, so there is almost no chance of pregnancy. What about sexually transmitted disease? Can Nexplanon fight sexually transmitted disease? Julia sobbed and shook her head, looking at her hands. Okay, you slept with that. Where was his wife when he had you? Landon asked. She was visiting her sister in Ohio, Julia said. How timely, Landon said. And how did that lead us to the Washington Post having the story? I think there was a reporter watching his house. They have pictures of me arriving in the evening and leaving the next morning in the same clothes, Julia explains. Another thing, about damn time, Landon said. Do you think I have been set up? Dennis set me up to ditch me, Julia said. I doubt she knucklehead is smart enough to organize something like that, but someone did. Jake thought for a moment before asking the next question. How do you know the Post has the article and the photos? They called both our offices looking for comments. We denied there was anything. And then they emailed the photos. Those were time-stamped and looked pretty bad. I look like I have been squeezed out, Julia replied. Landon rolled his eyes at her description of herself. Exactly what every husband wants to hear. His wife being rooted to a suite by another man. So, what's your plan? What are you and Dennis gonna do now? That's where I need you, Julia said. When I make a statement to Washington Post, I need you to make one too. You are going to say that you were aware that I stayed the night with Congressman Kilgallon and his wife in their guest room after the evening meeting. You see, they don't know his wife was out of town. If both spouses make statements in support of us, this whole affair will be forgotten. Julia leaned over the console, took Landon's right hand and looked at him seriously. Everything would go back to normal. Landon thought for a moment before answering. If I agree to this, I need complete honesty on your part. It is your only chance for amnesty. I'm going to ask you some questions about what's bothering me. Some I know, some I suspect. You don't know what they are, so this is your only chance for forgiveness. Do you understand? Julia understood Landon, but she wasn't happy about it. What if I don't want to answer the question? Then I won't testify. Besides, I will tell the post I'm filing for divorce, Landon said. Are you happy? She asked. You will not do that. It would ruin my political future. Then you better be damn honest in your answers, Landon said. He noted that she was worried about her political future but didn't mention the impacts on her marriage. Julia nodded in reluctant agreement. Question number 1. Have you had sex with any man or man other than me or Congressman Viagra since we got married? Tears came to Julia's eyes as she nodded. Pedro Luis Mulvano and Brad Ashley Yankee, third baseman and A-list actor. Damn! Landon shook his head. Mulvana I suspected because I knew you followed each other on social media, but I had no idea about Ashley. He just won an Oscar for directing, remember? I was invited to the awards ceremony, but you couldn't go. Landon nodded. I remember. I had to transport that serial rapist from Richmond to Omaha. Looking at his wife, Landon shook his head disappointedly. While I was transporting a dangerous criminal, you were getting nailed by some shitty actor from Boston? Married, if memory serves. We have only been married 9 months, and you have already slept with 3 other men, probably several times. Landon's shoulders slumped. He considered not asking the last question. He went over the pros and cons in his mind before making a decision. Okay, Julia, one last question. How did you support yourself in law school? And don't tell me bartending. I know that's what your official bio says, but I also know it is not true, so don't make me say it. Landon, if we stop now, we can go to counseling and work on our marriage. I love you. We can fix this, Julia pleaded. Answer the question, Julia. If I'm confident asking this question, then I know more than you think I do. Julia looked miserable as she stared out the side of the window of Landon's Bronco. Depending on the situation, she muttered. I didn't hear what you said, Julia. Can you say that again? Landon asked. Depending on the situation, she shouted. I'm a kept woman. Here. Are you happy? I was a kept woman. Creepy old man paid for me to have sex with them. Julia started sobbing so hard, Landon was afraid she was going to hyperventilate. I think being a kept woman is good practice before getting together with Congressman Old Balls, Landon said. Julia started crying even harder. It is okay, baby, Landon said. I just wanted to make sure you could be honest with me. It is over. I don't have any more questions. Landon put the Bronco in gear and drove home. As they crossed the Virginia border back into Maryland and home, Landon's mouth curled up in a smile for a split second. Julia had no question why Landon didn't ask for the reporter's contact information. At noon the next day, Landon met John Moody at the Key Street Deli. Marshal Kelly, nice to finally meet you, the reporter said. I wish I could say the same, Landon replied. He sat down, took off his Stetson, and placed it atop the chair beside him. Moody nodded. I can understand that. Believe it or not, I can appreciate your situation. 3 months ago, my wife left me when I found out she was having an affair with her married boss. He is still married. She is living in a studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet, and waiting for him to leave his wife. That sucks. Does his wife know? Landon asked. Not yet. His wife is pregnant. I'm going to wait until she has the baby and then blow the asshole's life up. I don't want to risk the baby. You are a good man, Landon said. What is wrong with people? Don't cheat, and if you want to sleep with someone, just walk away. John opened his notebook and said, Hey Marshal, before we get started, I need to know where a deputy marshal can meet, much less marry, a congresswoman, and not just any congresswoman, but the hottest one in Washington. Landon smiled at the bookstore. We both have degrees in the literary studies. We both reached for a copy of My Wicked Ways. It's a collection of poetry by Sandra Cisneros. Wow, I never realized you were a poetry buff. Moody laughed. I am not, Landon said. I just stood a meter away from her and recognized her, even in her Cubs baseball cap and sunglasses. Out of the corner of my eye, I followed her hands and guessed which book she was probably going to pick up. It just so happened that I reached for the same book she did at the same time. Coincidence, you know? Landon smiled, remembering how he would feign interest in Sandra Cisneros for the chance to talk to Julia. Moody laughed. Subtle, he said. You look like Raylan Gibbons. The hat, the badge, and the whole U.S. Marshal vibe, cool and calm. I have a feeling HDR didn't know what to expect when we met. She had only been in office for a couple of months before getting married. We dated for over a year and a half. Her authority grew steadily, and with it, her ego. Sometimes I think she thought I was part of her stuff. After a couple of months, I shut it down. She apologized and promised to make it right. And there have been marital bliss ever since, right? Landon grinned that. No, I wouldn't say that. Moody took the flash drive and examined it as if he would never seen one before. So what is on it? He asked. I recorded a conversation between me and Julia last night, Landon replied. Marshal Kelly, I appreciate your contacting me last week. What you told me about what you assumed was going to happen when you left town was brilliant. When you told me there would be a confrontation when you got home last night, I had no idea what to expect, but not this one. Moody slid the flash drive across the table back to Landon. Marshal, this isn't good for me. I can't use it. Oh, you absolutely can use it, no doubt about it. Moody shook his head. Anything you wrote down at home, I can't use. Not without your wife's consent, Landon smiled. Believe me, you can use that. Alright, Marshal Kelly. What makes you so sure I can use the recording? Moody asked. Because last night, when I got home, I felt like going to W Burger, Landon said. Oh, said Moody, confused by the sudden change. I don't understand. Have you ever eaten at a Youve burger? Landon asked. The best cheeseburgers in the 3-state area. Yes, they are great, but I don't see what your desire for a burger has to do with this entry, Landon smiled. Although there are several Youve burgers in Maryland, I prefer the one in McLean, Virginia. The reporter stared at Landon with a blank stare for 3 heartbeats before it got to him. Holy! Moody looked at Landon in awe. You got her to voluntarily leave the state with bilateral consent, drive to the state with unilateral consent, and record her confession. Sir, you have my respect. Landon smiled bitterly. I would rather have a faithful wife. Moody inserted the flash drive into the computer, plugged in his headphones, and began listening and taking notes. Landon began dolefully scrolling through the topic of infidelity on his iPhone while sipping his coffee. When the recording ended, Moody shook his head and looked at Landon with admiration. Man, that was really impressive. What she confessed to is going to blow her career to hell. But what about you too? How will you be able to stay married if you let me do this? He asked, pointing to the flash drive. Stay married? I'm not going to stay married to her, but you said you would forgive her if she answered your questions. Did you lie to her? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Landon said, raising his right hand to make the sign of the cross in the air above their table, saying the Latin phrase, the only Latin he would manage to learn after a million viewings of the Boondock Saints. Moody nodded his head. So you will forgive her, but you will divorce her and ruin her career in response. Landon mimicked the motion of an explosion by spreading his arms and said, bang. Landon had turned off his phone barely leaving the grocery store, so he was unaware of texts, missed calls, and voicemails from his wife. He didn't know that the Post was heavily advertising an exclusive bombshell report for the morning papers. The promos hinted that there was something between HDR and the Speaker of the House. The promos made all the major newspapers and news stations rush to find out what the Washington Post had unveiled from. At the offices of both House members in Congress, the phones were ringing off the hook. Their staffers were stoned and were handing out rebuttals left and right. Congresswoman Diaz Rojas sat in her office with her chief of staff and Congresswoman Fatima Alamu, an Ethiopian-born second-year lawmaker from Colorado. Fatima was part of the blue team and was second only to HDR in terms of media circulation. "I can't believe you had sex with Kilgallon," Fatima said. "How does it feel?" JD gave her friend a sore look. "Terrible, and I barely remember it. He is definitely Irish," she said, holding her thumb and forefinger 5 centimeters apart. "Isn't your husband Irish?" Rose Hunt, her human resources manager, asked. "There must be some latent blood in Landon because he is definitely not as Irish as the old boss speaker," Julia giggled. "Old axe?" Fatima asked. "That's what Landon called him. When I confessed last night, I still can't believe you told him everything," said Rose. "Whereas I would have tried to keep everything from the public. You went and confessed everything to your husband. What if he divorced you? He already said he would forgive me. We will start fresh, and I will be the best wife in the world. Until you stop," Fatima laughed. "Until I don't," Julia agreed. Senate Minority Leader Norman Newman was furious as he walked to House Speaker Dennis Kilgallon's office. "What a goddamn half-wit," he thought. "If he really did sleep HDR, his tiny Irish balls will be hanging from the rear-view mirror." Norm didn't bother knocking, barging into the Speaker's office. Dennis Kilgallon sat in the embrace with Fred Ford, his chief of staff, on a $20,000 white leather decayed sofa paid for the United States taxpayers. Tears streamed down Kilgallon's face as he looked at Senator Newman. "I didn't think anyone would find out about this," he muttered. "It would kill me at home." Norm had no sympathy. "So what happens? You thought you would get yourself some Mexican and no one would find out?" "Actually, I think the Congresswoman is Puerto Rican," Fred said. Newman looked at the chief of staff Kilgallon with irritation. "You thought you were gonna get some Latin? Is that better?" he bellowed, shifting his gaze from Kilgallon to his chief of staff. Fred knew the best answer to that question was no answer at all. "What am I supposed to do?" Kilgallon moaned. "Does Washington Post have anything on you? They have pictures of them coming to my house and leaving the same clothes the next morning. My wife was in Ohio, but no one knows about it. She testified that she was home and that nothing happened. It cost me another prenup." Kilgallon had a bitter, resigned look on his face. "That's good. Your wife covers your stupid ass. So what else you got? How about Titi Guevara? Did she confirm? And what about her husband? Isn't he a sheriff or something?" "He is Deputy United States Marshal," Fred said. Like on that TV show, Senator Newman had no idea what Chief of Staff was talking about. The only television he watched was Fox News, and he was pretty much done with them ever since they fired Booker Henderson for saying on live TV that Hitler had been badly misrepresented by the mainstream media and that slavery was a misunderstood social institution. Newman had stopped watching them. Newman rolled his eyes at Chief of Staff Kilgallon and mentally flagged that he needed to talk to him about replacing his Chief of Staff. Norm had a nephew looking for a job after his recent layoff. Julia was going to talk to him last night, tell him what's going on, and ask him to apply to the post. She is almost certain he will agree to corroborate the statements. "Almost sure," Newman repeated. "She's going to tell to her husband that she, a congresswoman who, by the way, is despised by her constituents, and he's going to accept that and not mind. He cast an incredulous look at Kilgallon. That's what she said. Congressman Kilgallon stared sullenly out the window overlooking the Capitol grounds. He needed 35 votes from members of Congress to become Speaker of the House of Representatives. None of the Democrats and very few of his own party wanted him as Speaker. Some members of his own party even voted for people who were not members of the House instead of voting for him during early voting. Even Vladimir Putin got 3 votes for Speaker, and someone wrote Hitler's ass instead of his votes. This still made Kilgallon angry. He didn't know if it was an actual vote for part of Hitler's anatomy or if someone made up a new nickname for him as Speaker of the House. Either way, since it wasn't a vote for Dennis Kilgallon, he was against him. To secure the position of Speaker of the House, he sold his soul to the extreme right wing of the party. The thought that he might lose the position because of a Washington Post report was a bitter pill to swallow. Senator Newman looked at Kilgallon in silence as he sat there sobbing. He didn't think he had ever seen a more pathetic sight in Washington, at least not since John Boehner became Speaker and was forced to show pictures of his new son-in-law. Julia was beyond furious when she got home to her apartment in Silver Springs. Her husband wasn't answering his cell phone or text messages. She found the Washington Post reporter's contact information and realized Landon hadn't even asked for it. How he was going to contact John Moody with no name or contact information. Landon wasn't home but had left a note on the kitchen table. Julia, I had to leave town, escorting Maria Bendrix to Washington. I will be back in a couple of days. The note made Julia even more annoyed, but explained why Landon hadn't responded. If he is in the air, that means out of touch. Julia decided to call reporter John Moody herself. "Hi John," she said when he answered. "This is Julia Diaz Rojas. Did my husband have time to give you an interview?" "We talked." Julia noticed that his answer was a little reserved. "So, did you realize that he knew I was spending the night with Congressman Kilgallon and his wife?" "Like I said, we talked," Moody replied. Julia felt the first waves of panic rising. "What did my husband say to you? Didn't he make it clear that he was aware of my visit?" "I think that's a conversation you need to have with your husband," he replied and hung up the phone. Julia looked at her phone in shock. She had never had a reporter hang up on her before. She picked up Landon's note and reread it. Never before had he given the name of the prisoner he was transporting. She typed Marcia Bendrix into Google, but the only reference she found was to a character in Graham Greene's novel The End of the Affair, which she vaguely remembered was about infidelity. Julia suddenly felt dizzy and sank heavily onto the couch. If the previous day was an 8 on the chaos scale on a 1 to 10, today was 100,000. Reporters were everywhere. Calls had to be dropped or the phone turned off. The story in the Post appeared this morning, first in the online edition and then in the print edition. When Julia arrived at her office, the Senate Majority Leader was waiting for her. She felt depressed and barely had the energy to walk from her car to her office. She recognized the beginnings of depression and felt helpless to do anything about it. The last person she wanted to meet was Senator Skip Siegel. Siegel entered her office with Julia telling his chief of staff to leave them alone. "Is there anything else we need to talk about?" "The confession your husband recorded was pretty comprehensive. I have never heard of someone so truthfully destroying their marriage and career. I mean, I'm almost in awe. It is like you made a plan and you stuck to it. The first thing about destroying your marriage, confessing to cheating, check. Confess to working as a prostitute, check. Then you said to yourself, hey, the fact that I'm destroying my marriage isn't enough. How can I set my career on fire? Cheating? It happens. Prostitution? Yes, please. Sex with an older member of the opposite party whom I despise? Sign me up. Skip Siegel looked at Julia and shook his head in mock admiration, as if she were the love child of Wilbur Mills and Gary Condit. Julia sat at her desk and glared sullenly at Senator Siegel. She had no idea who the two men were, but she knew she had just been insulted. So what about the healthcare bill you were so desperate to pass? You know it's a complete failure, right? This country was the closest it's ever come to having full healthcare become law for the country, and it failed because you couldn't keep your feet together. And then you also confessed everything to your husband. Skip Siegel looked at Julia and shook his head, thinking it was all for nothing. As she sobbed at her desk, "What's going to happen now?" Coleman Cole Kelly asked his cousin. He and Landon were sipping bourbon on the spacious porch of the Kelly family ranch. Landon had arrived last night, and Cole had arrived this morning. Landon took a sip of his Milam and Green Tribble cask bourbon and sipped. Texas distilleries were starting to produce the best whiskey in the world for drinking, and for his money, the three ladies behind Milam and Green were making the best of the best. "At the very least, a divorce," he replied. "I'm not sure her career will survive that, but then again, I don't care much about that. I have got an appointment with Derridge and Sullivan from the family law departments at BMXG to get things started. I will take a couple of weeks off to fish and relax." Cole nodded. He was a special agent with the Army Criminal Investigation Division and was currently stationed at Fort Cavazos. It was convenient to the family ranch, located 15 miles southwest of Austin and a couple of hours' drive from the base. Cole was a frequent visitor to the ranch to see his adopted sister and grandmother and sometimes his father, who lived in Austin itself. Cole took a sip of bourbon. He sympathized with his cousin. He would have problems with his wife before. "I could take a few days off. We could spend a few days riding the ranch. How long has it been since you've been on a horse? I bet living in a condo has made you soft. You know, riding around the ranch sounds nice, but it's been a long time since I've ridden a horse. I think that's what I need, to trade one pain for a pain in the ass." Landon took another sip of whiskey. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.